Hello and welcome to this channel. My name is Dick van Oeveren, and in this video I will show you the great improvements and simplifications that Aruba Networks have made to the configuration and setup of dynamic segmentation with user-based tunneling. And of course I will also show you how this all works in the real world by going through all the configurations. First, let me start by giving a quick overview of user-based tunneling with Aruba Networks. Really, the architecture is very simple. Dynamic segmentation introduces the concept of colorless ports. With colorless port, it really doesn't matter what you are connecting to a switch. Based on the identity of the device, the appropriate access profile is pushed to the edge port by the ClearPass policy manager. The big advantage of this is that when a device moves to a different port or even a different switch or location, the profile moves with the device. This really simplifies the configuration on the switch, and you have a centralized policy manager by using ClearPass Policy Manager. Now with dynamic segmentation, Aruba Networks is adding even more control. As said, ClearPass Policy Manager is providing user role information to the switch and assigns the appropriate parameters to the user. What ClearPass Policy Manager can also do is provide a parameter that is called the secondary user role. The secondary user role tells the switch to establish a tunnel to a mobility controller for that specific user. The name of that secondary user role will be the role that has been defined on the mobility controller. The big advantage that comes with this feature is that on the mobility controller, you can perform additional services like fingerprinting, advanced firewalling, either internal or external, through a third-party layer 7 firewall, or even integrate with Aruba Networking's first-class user behavior analytics solution called Introspect. Let me now give you a short overview of the things that are improved with the new release of software for the Aruba switches, mobility controllers, and ClearPass Policy Manager. First, it's important to understand what some of the caveats were with the older software releases. In order to be able to download the user roles from the ClearPass Policy Manager, a root certificate had to be installed on the switch. This was a manual job. In other words, you had to extract the root certificate from ClearPass, create a trusted anchor crypto entry, and then manually download the certificate into the trusted anchor through TFTP or SFTP. Another caveat in the previous releases was that when a VLAN was pushed through a user role from ClearPass, that VLAN had to be configured on the access switch. In other words, if you had a lot of VLANs configured for different profiles, these VLANs had to exist in the configuration of all the switches. And last but not least, for monitoring purposes, if you wanted to show the tunnel users on the mobility controllers, you had to go into the CLI and perform some CLI commands to check out the tunnel users. All of these caveats have been removed with the introduction of Aruba OS Switch Software 16.08. With this release, you can now download the root certificate from ClearPass directly. In order for this to work, you need ClearPass to be running at least software release 6.7.8. In the demonstration later on, I will show you how this works. It is very simple. As for the VLAN caveat, this requirement is now totally gone. You don't have to configure any VLANs anymore on the switches in order for user-based tunneling to work. What it's done is that there is a single VLAN reserve that will carry all the control traffic for designating the appropriate VLAN to the device. On the mobility controller, you will have an option to configure the VLAN that has been configured for that secondary user role. That means that for the mobility controller, you need to run the latest software code, which is 8.4. This code will give you that option. Same as the certificate download, I will show you how to do this later on in the video. Also a very easy task to perform. As for monitoring the tunnel users on the mobility controller, you can now forget about the CLI. That information is available at your fingertips in the graphical user interface. Let me show you how it all works. Here's the setup. It's very straightforward. There's an access switch. I'm connecting an 802.1x client to the access port, and the switch will contain a radius setup connecting to ClearPass and a tunnel configuration that allows you to establish a user-based tunnel to the mobility controller. The switch is running software release 16.08. ClearPass is running on release 6.7.8, and the mobility controller is on release 8.4. Let me first show you the setup on the switch and start with the configuration of the radius server entry for connecting to ClearPass. Right, so configuring the radius server. This will be the ClearPass server, providing a key. And what I also have to do is I have to specify that this is a ClearPass server. So with this command, I'm telling the switch that the radius server is a ClearPass server. You have to provide this information to the switch so that it will allow you to download the CA certificate. Okay, so two more commands to configure for radius is one is the dynamic authorization, which will allow you to change things like VLANs after authentication. And another one is I have to set the time window to 0 to allow re-authentication with ClearPass. Accounting, just enable accounting for this. Update periodic 3 minutes, and AA accounting network, and I'm going to do the start stop for radius. So that's your radius configuration. Because we are working with certificates for downloading user roles, it is crucial that the clock on the access switch and on ClearPass are synchronized. So we need to configure NTP for this. Okay, let's do that. Time sync NTP. We are using unicast mode, and configure an NTP server. Server 192.168.0.24, which is an NTP server that is configured on my network. And let's enable NTP here. Another thing that I can set is my daylight saving for Western Europe, and I can set a time zone offset of 60 minutes. Okay, so what we can do is show NTP status. It's not synced yet, so leave that run. We'll leave that running for a couple of minutes and then check out later on whether time has synchronized. Next is downloading the certificate. This is done with one simple command. Before I do that, let me just enable debugging. Debug destination session. And let me just debug the events so that you can see what's happening. Now, I said the download of the certificate is very straightforward. It is one single command here. So it's crypto CA download usage ClearPass, and we are forcing the download now. And what you can see is it successfully downloaded the certificate from the server. So you don't need to create a trusted anchor anymore. You don't need to manually download the certificate anymore with SFTP or TFTP. Really, really very simple. Now, in order to be able to download the user roles, you have to specify a ClearPass user on the switch. This account will then be used in conjunction with the certificate to download the user roles dynamically on the switch. Again, one command, that's the radius server CPPM, so ClearPass Policy Manager, identity, your admin, so that this is an admin account that I've created on ClearPass. I will show you that later on, with a key, so that will be the password. The next step is to get the tunnel configuration with the mobility controller to work. Again, a very easy configuration task. It consists of two commands. One is to configure the controller IP address, and the second command is to enable role-based tunneling and assign a reserved VLAN for the control traffic. With regards to the role for the tunnel server, you have two options. So it's either port-based or role-based. When you configure the port-based role, the switch will be adopting port-based tunneling. So the main difference between port-based tunneling and user-based tunneling is that with port-based tunneling, the access port is tunneled directly to the mobility controller, and access security enforcement is completely done on the mobility controller. With role-based control, the user role is applied per user on the access port of the switch. So the security enforcement takes place straight at the edge. Before configuring the tunnel node server, let me enable debugging for user-based tunneling. That's debug user tn. So reason for doing this is that what you will see as soon as I've configured the IP address of the controller, a tunnel is created for that controller. This is called the switch anchor controller tunnel. It sounds very academic, but it's basically the control plane that is established between the switch and the mobility controller. So let's get into the tunnel node server context and configure the controller IP 154 and set the mode to role-based and set a reserved VLAN of 4090. So that will be my reserved VLAN. And as you can see, the switch anchor controller tunnel is created. So this is the control plane between the switch and the mobility controller. We're almost there. We also have to tell the switch that it has to work with downloadable user roles. These are the user roles that are pushed from ClearPass. The access switch can also work with local user roles. So these are the user roles that are configured locally on the switch. The advantage of using local user roles is that you can specify, so like specifically assign user roles that are designated for that given switch only, because they only exist on that switch. And that's also kind of a disadvantage because you don't have those user roles in a central place anymore, like you would have with when you use downloadable user roles with ClearPass. This is the command to enable downloadable user roles. So that's AAA, Authorization, user role, enable, download. Okay. And then the last step is to configure port access and enable 802.1x on the access port. In this example, we're just using port 1 as access port. And as I said, you can have multiple authentications on a single port. So you can have MacAuth, Captive Portal, and 802.1x on a single port. And on an Aruba OS switch, you can have up to 32 concurrent authentications on a single port. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set the port access authentication type to EAP, which is AAA authentication port access EAP radius. And we enable AAA on the port. So AAA port access authenticator 1. And we're also setting a client limit on the port, AAA port access authenticator, port 1, client limit 3. So we can have up to 3 802.1x clients. And we enable 802.1x globally, AAA port access authenticator active. And that's really it for the switch. Let me just, before I show you the full configuration, let me check whether NTP is synchronized, and it is, so that's cool. Let me show you the full configuration. And as you can see, it's not a huge configuration at all. Everything is controlled from ClearPass and the mobility controllers. So before we get to the configuration in ClearPass and the mobility controller, I have checked that the time is synchronized. Right, let's do that again. That's really important. And so that's cool. So next step is to check out ClearPass. Next is ClearPass. Let me go through the setup here. Log in first. Okay, let me show you the REST client. And that's this one I've configured. Pretty straightforward. That's the IP address and the radius shared secret. It's a Hewlett Packard Enterprise. That's the vendor name. So pretty straightforward. The other thing is for the downloadable user role. There's the admin user. So there's your dir admin. There you go. And the privilege level that I've set for this user is read-only administrator. Okay. I'm using the, by the way, for the authentication, I'm using the local database, just to make it easy. Okay, so next step is to configure the downloadable user role service. We start off with the profile. Let me create one. And this is going to be a downloadable role enforcement. Let's give it a name, dir.1x. And so for the role configuration, I have two options. So I can either do standard or advanced. So with the standard option will give you a nice form that you can fill in. And with the advanced option, you have to create the full script in the attributes section. So it's really it's more complex way of getting this to work. For now, we'll just stick with the standard form, and then in that form we will configure VLAN 110 as VLAN the user will be assigned to, and the secondary user role is called employee. So, and the other thing that we have to do is to set the product type to Aruba OS switch. So here's the role configuration, setting the secondary role to employee, and my VLAN ID to 110. I can also use tagged VLANs if I want to. There's this whole class configuration that you can use. So things like ACLs you can also configure here. Okay, so that's your profile. Next is creating a policy where you assign a profile to. Okay, let's create one. Let's call this dir 802.1x. And what we're going to do is, so it's radius, we can do a default profile, which will be deny access. And then what we can do is we can add a rule here. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a tips role equals user authenticated. So when the user is authenticated, I can assign the downloadable .1x profile. Okay, that's really it for the policy, really straightforward and simple. And then the last step is to configure the service. So what I'm going to do is add one. just a straightforward 802.1x wired access service. Let's call it 1x. Okay. So we're going to add a repository. That's the local user repository. And the enforcement will be downloadable user role 802.1x. Save. And that is it for ClearPass. Now let's check out the mobility controller. Let's log into the mobility controller. The first step is to configure a VLAN and assign the relevant parameters. Let's go to the interfaces, go to VLANs and create one. Let's give it a name and a number. Selected. There you go. Go to the IPv4 settings. So it's going to be static. 1. We'll be configuring DHCP on this VLAN, so the controller will be providing DHCP services. You can see, well, the details are already entered there, and so submitted. Oh, the other thing, yeah, so submitted. The other thing to configure is what I can also do is configure network address translation. Let me just go down here a bit, and I'm configuring net inside. So we use the inside net because we are netting the VLAN itself going out to the other networks to which the mobility controller is connected. Okay, submitted. And let me push that configuration to the mobility controller. Okay. The next step is to configure the role. This is the secondary role that has been configured on ClearPass and has been pushed to the switch. So roles and policies, I'm here, and let me create one called employee. What I can do with this role, I can assign various different rules to this role. For now, I will be assigning the allow all rule, just to allow all the traffic. But I mean, you can, if you want, you can specify different rules here. Okay. And now there's another important step that you don't have to forget. In the role on the mobility controller, you also have to specify the terminating VLAN. If you don't specify this, the user will end up in the reserved VLAN that you have configured on the switch, and therefore it just disappears into a black hole. What you can do is you can set the VLAN by clicking on the More hyperlink and configure the VLAN here. Okay, so that's in the network settings. So in the network section, you will find the VLAN select list, and there's where you assign the employee VLAN. Let me submit it again, and then push the changes. And that's really it for the configuration. One other very important thing to mention is following. In the previous releases, there was no license enforcement for dynamic segmentation on the mobility controllers. With the introduction of Aruba OS release 8.4, there is license enforcement for sure. Now, licensing is very, very easy. Um, what you will need is that for each switch, you will require a single AP license suite. This is a combined um, access point, policy engine firewall, and RF Protect license. If you have a stack of switches, this still requires a single AP license suite. So, for example, a stack of 4 switches requires 1 license. Now let's see some action. So here's the switch console. Uh, I've got user tunnel debugging enabled. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to connect the user and I'm going to enter the credentials on that workstation. Let's see what's happening here. You can see now that the tunnel is established to user anchor controller 192.168.0.154. So as I said, so the tunnel is established with the user anchor controller. That's another academic word, but it means nothing more than this being the data plane tunnel between the mobility controller and the switch. So with user-based tunneling, you will have a single control plane connection between the switch and switch anchor controller. And per device, you will have a separate data plane connection between the switch and the user anchor controller. If you have multiple mobility controllers, there's also redundancy. So what will happen is that there will be a dormant connection to a secondary switch anchor controller and a dormant entry to a secondary user anchor controller. This means that if there is a failure on one of the connections, there's an instant failover to the secondary controller. Once the tunnel is established, now let's check out all the status information. We can do that on the switch. Show port access client 1 in detail. You can see that the user is authenticated using downloadable user role. You can see here that it's using the reserved VLAN. So on the switch, you cannot really see that it's using VLAN 110 because that enforcement is done in the secondary user role. I can also do a show tunneled node server state. And I can do a show tunneled node users all. Another thing you can see on the switch is which user roles have been downloaded. So I can do that with this command, user role downloaded detailed. So this is the user role that has been downloaded. The great thing about downloadable user roles is that they are dynamic. Once the user role is downloaded, it stays on the switch. So that means if a device reconnects, there's no requirement for downloading the user role anymore. However, if you make a change to the user role in ClearPass, that user role is changed on the switches as well the next time authentication takes place. So there's a verification mechanism in place that checks whether the downloadable user role has changed. If it has, the new user role is downloaded. That's all looking good. Let's check out ClearPass. Let's go to the access tracker. You can see here the event happening here, and you can see that the user role has been this user role has been pushed, enforcing VLAN 110 and the secondary user role employee. And then also let me show you what's happening on the mobility controller. As said, with the introduction of Aruba OS 8.4, you can now get wired user information on the GUI. You can see here, when I click on clients, you can see also the wired clients that are connected here. You can see that the client has received an IP address. You can get all this great information. One of the other things you can do here is you can add or delete extra columns to check out what other information is there. Right, so you can add or remove columns here. Really, really cool. What you can also do is there are some hyperlinks so connected to the access switch. So this would be your tunnel client. Again, you have additional columns that show you some additional information here. Really cool. And then I can also connect to the mobility controller and show that information. So this concludes this video covering the new dynamic segmentation features that are available as of December 2018. I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or suggestions for other topics to cover, let us know. And for now, thanks for watching and hope to see you soon on this channel again.